Fine.
Just between that and burning to death, I think I would have jumped too.
Not helping.
All right, just tell me what you're really looking for.
This?
Spoiler warning, I am going to say very few nice things about the entirety of the Uncharted series over the next few, however many paragraphs. This does not mean that I think Naughty Dog are bad game developers. The Crash Bandicoot and Last of Us titles are all games I've enjoyed, but I do think that there were a series of bad decisions made when it came to the design and development of Uncharted. If I'd never enjoyed any of Naughty Dog's games, then I wouldn't have bothered going so in-depth like this, but it's because I do like their other games that I wanted to take a deeper look at Uncharted, the reasons I don't like it, and why those same things aren't an issue for me in The Last of Us. So, knowing that none of this is some kind of personal attack on the developers, let's get straight into it. Boy, do I hate this series. Uncharted is the first and I hope only game series I can only describe as having hate played my way through. As in, I didn't enjoy any of the games, but made sure to play my way through all 4 of the main installments so I could get the full story of Nathan Drake and his amicable chums. Why would any sane person do this? Why play through 4 lengthy story campaigns when I had already decided I didn't like this style of game halfway through the first title? Because of people. I completed the first Uncharted years ago, and I predictably shouted from the treetops about how much I had not enjoyed it. I told everyone I knew, and they all said the same thing to me. The second one was way better. Apparently it was more bombastic, refined, and had a better story and looked better and yada 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 yada. I didn't care. I wasn't going to go out of my way to buy and play a game that I had a feeling I probably wouldn't like. And whilst I stuck to that commitment, there was a nagging feeling at the back of my head that there was a chance they were right. And with the reviews and praise the Uncharted games received from all kinds of people and publications, maybe my negative feelings about the game were a one-off. Fast forward 7-ish years later to the post-apocalyptic dystopia that is 2020, and I found myself downloading Uncharted: The Nathan Drake Collection. A catalogue of the first 3 Uncharted games remastered and bundled together for PS4. Now was my chance to set the record straight with myself on whether or not these games were any good. 60 or so hours later, I came to my conclusion. In diplomatic terms, I would say that these games were not for me. They're well made and their achievements artistically, graphically and sonically push the boundaries so far to the point that the presentation has held up really well considering the first game came out over a decade ago. The art direction as a whole is wonderful and does bring a sense of adventurous fun with the numerous attractive locales that the games consist of, but the surface level presentation of Uncharted was never an issue, even for its greatest detractors. The problem I have with all of the games in this series goes all the way to the core concept. It is a wannabe Indiana Jones adventure, but with the plot points and body count of an 80s Schwarzenegger film. The two don't mesh. You either go family-friendly treasure hunting, or you go R-rated bloodbath. You don't get to extinguish a few dozen human lives and then quip about how you have to travel economy on the flight back home. Despite this incompatible melding of atmospheres, I think I understand how it likely came about. It was the mid-2000s, and with some of the most successful games of that generation being third-person cover-based shooters, I imagine trying to make a big-budget action-adventure game that didn't slot into that niche simply wouldn't have cut it. You can feel it the moment the shooting first starts in any Uncharted title. The cover mechanics, the waves of enemies, the uber-sized gun nuts that serve as mini-bosses, and a complete lack of any kind of self-reflection on the part of the main characters. In something like Gears of War, all of that makes sense. It fits with the setting, the characters, the story. You're a soldier in a fight to the death, and the only tools at your disposal, that makes sense, are your weapons and your ability to kill. In Uncharted, it makes zero sense. You're meant to be a treasure hunter trying to get rich, not a woefully underprepared one-man guerrilla army. You're essentially playing as a serial killer trying to steal some other culture's ancient artifact before some other asshole gets there first. There is no thought given to all the killing, no justification, no half-baked ideology to make it seem in the slightest bit okay that all these goons were getting gunned down. It's not until the 4th game that you even get some kind of candid dialogue from the average henchman talking about what massive dicks they are to make you feel better about offing them. Having gun combat be the main pillar on which the gameplay sits on creates a massive amount of ludo-narrative dissonance. And the fact that characters are so light-hearted doesn't help matters either. If the protagonists were grizzled ex-paramilitaries who had to treasure hunt because it was their only way to make a living, then that could maybe work, but they're not. There isn't even any kind of Far Cry 3-esque arc for the characters to become amoral killers so that everything makes a bit more sense by the end of it. In each game in the series, they start off light-hearted, kill a few hundred people, and then end light-hearted. To circle back to what I was saying earlier, this is likely due to the era that the first Uncharted came out in. The pressure to make a blockbuster title using mechanics that were the most successful and popular at the time, but having the gun combat be the main pillar goes against the rest of the tone of the game. Unfortunately, the gun combat is also the most fleshed out pillar in the entire series. In Uncharted, the gameplay can be split into combat, armed and unarmed, climbing and exploration, puzzles, and to a lesser extent, set pieces. The problem is that outside of combat, the rest of these pillars are painfully underdeveloped, meaning combat has to do most of the heavy lifting. That would be bad enough if the combat was good, but it isn't. At a base level, the combat works. You have a variety of available guns to use, different guns serve different purposes, and the ammo is usually sparse enough that you have to keep moving to find more of it, or get a different weapon. The problem isn't so much the gun combat on the part of the player, but on the part of the enemies. Firstly, there is a ton of them. In every combat encounter, you mow down dozens and dozens of pirates, private security guards, and small armies. Once you think you've taken everyone out, another squadron will bundle in from some previously unseen back entrance. It is fatiguing and anti-fun. Cut every combat encounter by 50% and you immediately have a better game. If you're fighting wave after wave of enemies, eventually it isn't testing any kind of player's skill, it's just padding for time. Secondly, the enemies are simply frustrating. Combine constantly flanking enemies that have pinpoint grenade throwing accuracy with a cover system that only sometimes does what you want it to do, and you get some of the most disheartening combat encounters imaginable. I'm talking controller out the window levels of bullshit when it comes to certain gunfights in these games. Climbing and exploration. I will give Naughty Dog credit here in the way of their level design. None of the Uncharted games use minimaps or waypoints, instead directing a player to their goal using the environment, dialogue, and other audio-visual cues. Most of the time it works pretty well. The climbing and exploring itself, however, is another matter. Visually, the climbing looks great, fluid, and believable, but the gameplay part is sorely lacking. The crux of the issue being the severity of the linearity and the emphasis on spectacle. Naughty Dog prioritized the spectacle instead of the mechanics when it came to the climbing, and a lot of other things. This means that every step, climb, swing, and jump is handcrafted to look visually engaging, most often by having the main character just barely making the jump, every single time. This then completely negates the point of the character just barely making a jump. If it happens once, that's shocking. If it happens every time, it's boring. And whilst this looks good, it means that any kind of skill, strategy, or agency on the part of the player is thrown off a cliff edge. The player doesn't have to bother gauging a distance, judging a fall, or questioning a leap. They either follow the route set by the designer, or they die. And this leads to all kinds of inconsistencies. Jumps that look impossible in one scenario are easily overcome in the next. Rocks you think you can leap onto are suddenly fatal falls, and you the player just go into autopilot, finding the next rock you can see instead of engaging and trying to think about your route to the goal. Imagine if climbing from the likes of Breath of the Wild or Assassin's Creed was utilized instead, where the player has a set of climbing and traversal mechanics and must make their own way to the objective by improvising their own route from one of the several different options that lie before them. I'm not asking for a full-on open world experience, I'm asking for a mechanic that gives the player a challenge and some kind of agency in their actions. The biggest culprit, however, when it comes to half-baked and underutilized gameplay pillars is the puzzles. I always felt that their inclusion was more of a smokescreen to try and keep up the pretense that this game was about finding treasure and not exterminating your fellow man. For one, there's not many of them, and for two, they either fall into the category of being too easy, with the answer being outright shown to you in your journal, or they're following some mirror world version of logic which is impossible to grasp until an NPC shouts the answer to you. Either way, just like the climbing, it doesn't engage. It doesn't ask you to put on your Indiana Jones hat and recall some information you gathered previously and apply it in some kind of creative way. And all of this is just a symptom of the wider problem. These games should not have been given these mechanics. A game about a treasure hunter should not have put a priority on third-person cover-based shooting, with linear exploration and a handful of puzzles provided as an afterthought. If the Uncharted series had been conceived in the years after cover-based shooters hit their high point, I think we would have received a very different game. With the rise in narrative-driven games that didn't default to cover-based shooting and instead made extended use of dialogue, deeper puzzle mechanics, and multiple-choice paths, an Uncharted game made in this environment could have been so much more interesting. Imagine if a level started and you were tasked with finding some kind of clue to a treasure that you seek. You're given the vaguest of information and then you are sent into a populated area. You ask some of the locals about the vague clue and they point you in the direction of some related ruins. You write down the information that they give you and then head off. You then explore the ruins non-linearly, making use of a set of various tools, ropes, climbing gear, those pickaxe things, whatever. You come across riddles or puzzles and solve them, maybe using the information given to you by the locals you spoke to earlier. I know this isn't 100% airtight, there's plenty of gaps in this example, but the point I'm trying to get at is that the Uncharted series should have been different and could have been so much more interesting given the subject matter and the budget afforded to it. My final whinge is, and this might just be me being even more petty than usual, is that there is an air of condescension about the whole thing. As if the game thinks you're a 5-year-old, and it's constantly trying to convince you that, no really, this is some exciting stuff happening. Oh no, look out, Nate's about to fall off a cliff. Again. He really is in danger this time. It's a pantomime. Because the games are continually shoving spectacle into your eye sockets, it means a non-stop barrage of exciting things have to happen. And the problem with constant exciting things is that they are no longer exciting. They become the norm. For exciting things to have any kind of impact, there needs to be a non-exciting thing happening at some point. It sounds like a petty quibble, but honestly, the trope of Nate climbing a ledge and that ledge breaking suddenly seems to happen at least once every climbing section. And every single time we have Nate going, whoa, that was a close one. If this happened once or twice and actually served any kind of purpose apart from further padding, it would have actual impact. But instead, it's just the characters going, whoa, or oh crap, whilst my half-open eyelids stare on. This, the scripted sequences when running away from a threat, every fall from a ledge and every overexerted grunt just screams out some kind of pantomime aesthetic that immediately loses its charm once it becomes apparent. When I told a friend that I was making my way through this series and that I wasn't enjoying myself one bit, his response was, "But you like The Last of Us? Aren't they the same game?" I had to pick myself up off the floor after falling out of my chair due to such a statement. Whilst I can see that both series are third-person action adventures that make use of cover and shooting mechanics, It's the implementation and the context that split them worlds apart. The Last of Us takes place in a post-apocalyptic dystopia where killing almost everyone you come across feels like a necessity. I'm okay with killing people in The Last of Us because of the nature of the world it is set in. And by the way, The Last of Us doesn't pad out its combat encounters with wave after wave of enemies. These encounters are usually much smaller, more deliberate, and impactful affairs. And whilst there is some levity in the dialogue or a joke or two across the entire story, the characters do not talk lightly about a situation and their actions. They have weight and meaning. This is the importance of context. The context should let you know what you're about to get into, even subconsciously. You should have an idea of the tone, the atmosphere, and the expectations of what you're about to experience. The Last of Us succeeds brilliantly, whereas Uncharted doesn't. I'm not going to dunk on Uncharted for having the audacity of being developed 6 years before The Last of Us, and therefore having zero experience to build off of, but the difference between the two is night and day. I will say that I think that some lessons were learned by the time Uncharted 4 rolled around, as I found that to commit the fewest of the aforementioned crimes that I've been whinging about. There's more character complexity, the aforementioned dialogue from enemy grunts actually making them less sympathetic, more creative expression in things like combat and exploration with the addition of the grapple hook, and whilst there was still plenty of equipping, it felt at least a tad toned down. Anyways, those were my thoughts on the Uncharted series. To reiterate, I don't think the games are poorly made or that Naughty Dog are bad game developers. It's almost more of a flashpoint of ideas, designs, timing and marketing that ended up making a massive hit that I completely disagreed with. So, Uncharted, the only series I hate played my way through so that no one could tell me that I had simply missed out on a good one. And what was the first thing someone said to me once I had finished my hateful playthrough? You should play Lost Legacy, that's the best one.